The Voodoocast. Pneumono-ultra-microscopic silico-volcano-coniosis. The Black Lung. Art, radicalism, sex. Interviews that never happen, generated by AI.
Welcome to Voodoocast, or Pneumono-ultra-microscopic silico-volcano-coniosis, a podcast that never happened. Still, I am thrilled to welcome a virtual Nina Simone to our first show. So let us jump right into it. The year is 2026. Things are looking a bit grim out there. Miss Simone, is there hope for the USA?
Hope is not something I give to nations. Nations are too abstract for that. But people can still choose. The United States of America has always lived with a contradiction. It never fully resolved. It tells a beautiful story about freedom while practicing a very selective version of it. That tension did not begin recently, and it will not end with one election, one president, or one movement. So the real question is not whether there is hope. The question is whether Americans are finally willing to pay the price of the ideals they celebrate. Democracy is not self-sustaining. It requires education, memory, discomfort, and sacrifice. What I see now is a country that wants the performance of democracy without the discipline of it, rights without responsibility, freedom without consequence. But listen carefully. Despair is a luxury of those who can afford disengagement. The people who have always been pushed to the margins in America never had the option of giving up. They organized, they sang, they endured, they resisted, often without cameras, without applause, without guarantees. If the United States listens to its most inconvenient voices, not the loudest, not the richest, not the most entertaining, then yes, there is possibility, not redemption. Possibility. Hope does not come from believing things will work out. Hope comes from deciding that some things are worth fighting for, even if they do not. That is the test. And it has always been the test.
The word test is the best way to bridge our minds to the next question. You have been tested, and you have been testing. You are a fighter. Civil rights, women rights, with force and might. Nina, you have always been a radical. How about radicalism in 2026?
Radicalism is not a costume. It is a willingness to accept consequences. Young people today ask how radical they should be because they have been taught to measure dissent by volume instead of by risk. True radicalism is not how loudly you speak. It is how much comfort you are willing to give up. So let me be precise. Young people should be radical enough to be inconvenient, not performative, not trendy, inconvenient, radical enough to study systems instead of only denouncing symbols, radical enough to organize locally when no one is watching, radical enough to refuse careers that require moral anesthesia, radical enough to stay when the work becomes boring, slow, and unglamorous. Burning language is easy. Sustained discipline is radical. In my time, radicalism meant risking jail, exile, livelihood, sanity. Today, the risks look different, but they are real. Precarity, isolation, surveillance, economic punishment. If your radicalism costs you nothing, it is likely decorative. But I will also say this: radicalism without rigor collapses into chaos. Anger without strategy exhausts itself. You must know what you are against and what you are building in its place. So how radical should young people be? Radical enough to outlast the moment. Radical enough to choose clarity over virality. Radical enough to understand that justice is not an attitude, it is a practice. Anything less is commentary, anything more without discipline is self-destruction. The goal is not to feel radical. The goal is to make injustice impossible to ignore and impossible to maintain.
Injustice comes in various forms and colors. Dealing with injustices has always been your issue. Nowadays, injustices seem to be gaining ground. It is frightening. We will get to the creep president of the USA a bit later. But since I live in France, I would like to know your opinion on President Macron.
I don't judge presidents by their vocabulary or their elegance. I judge them by who sleeps peacefully and who does not. Power always speaks of reform. Justice is quieter. If a leader governs mainly by reassurance of markets, of institutions, of continuity, then change becomes cosmetic, not moral. He is intelligent, articulate, and careful. Careful leaders rarely frighten injustice. They negotiate with it. And injustice loves negotiation because it buys time. Let me be precise. Technocracy is not leadership. Management is not vision. A president should make the comfortable uneasy and the forgotten visible. When stability becomes the highest value, it is usually paid for by those with the least voice. History will not ask whether he was competent. It will ask who benefited from that competence and who was asked to wait again.
Voodoocast, the podcast that never happened. Happy to welcome Nina Simone, even though she was never here. Back to the facts. The elephant in the room. As individuals, as a nation, as a planet, we are suffering under President Trump.
He is not an accident. That is what people misunderstand. He is not a rupture in democracy. He is a mirror held up to it. Loud, crude, undisciplined, yes. But mirrors do not invent faces, they reveal them. Trump did not lower the level of discourse. He exposed how shallow it already was. He spoke in impulses because the system had trained people to respond only to impulses. Anger, fear, spectacle, those were already the currency. He simply spent them without shame. What troubles me is not the man. Men like that come and go. What troubles me is how many people recognized themselves in him and felt relieved. Relieved to stop pretending to be decent. Relieved to confuse cruelty with honesty. A serious society produces serious leaders. A society addicted to spectacle produces performers. Trump is a performer born of neglect of education, of memory, of moral rigor. So no, I do not ask whether he is good or bad. That is too small a question. I ask what conditions made him inevitable, and why so many were willing to call inevitability truth. That is not his indictment alone. That is America examining itself.
The Nina Simone with me is not the real thing. Still, I am curious. It is 2026. What are your next steps?
Next steps imply a ladder. I never climbed ladders. I followed necessity. Artistically, I am interested in distillation. Fewer notes, fewer words, more risk. If I were working now, I would strip everything back to what cannot be faked: piano, breath, silence. I would not chase relevance. I would test endurance. I would record less and perform more, because performance still requires presence, and presence cannot be edited. I would also teach quietly, seriously. Technique is a form of respect for the music and for yourself. Too many artists are being encouraged to express before they are equipped to say anything precise. Art at this stage is not about expansion. It is about accuracy.
Nina, you have always been a political artist. What can we expect from a political standpoint?
Politically, I am not interested in parties. I am interested in pressure. Politics has become a spectacle of opinions instead of a struggle over material conditions. My work would be to make that gap unbearable. To insist, again, that civil rights without economic justice are unfinished sentences. I would support organizations that educate, not brand, that organize locally, not perform nationally. And I would remain deeply suspicious of applause, because applause often replaces action. Most importantly, I would refuse fatigue. Fatigue is the system's most effective weapon. When people are tired, they accept what they would otherwise resist. So my next steps are the same as my previous ones: to tell the truth with discipline, to make comfort nervous, and to remind people that freedom is not a feeling, it is a practice that has never changed.
Let us go back. You are a civil rights leader. Your assessment of the present. Are you satisfied?
Satisfied? No. One does not become satisfied with a wound simply because it has stopped bleeding openly. In the United States of America, civil rights have been treated like a finished project, something to commemorate rather than continue. Laws were passed, speeches were archived, holidays were declared. But justice is not a museum exhibit. It either lives in practice or decays into symbolism. What exists now is a dangerous illusion of progress. Rights are recognized more often than they are protected. Visibility has increased, vulnerability has not decreased at the same pace. People are encouraged to speak but punished when their speech threatens power. That is not equality, that is choreography. Let me be clear, representation is not liberation. Policy without enforcement is theater. An inclusion that leaves economic violence untouched is cosmetic. The language has improved. The structures have not improved enough. Civil rights were never about comfort. They were about redistribution of power, social, legal, economic. Any society that celebrates the rhetoric of equality while tolerating permanent inequality has chosen stability over justice. So no, I am not satisfied. Satisfaction is what you feel when you believe the work is done. The work is not done. And anyone telling you otherwise is either exhausted or invested in things staying exactly as they are.
Nina Simone, as strong and powerful as you always have been. As a woman, a black woman, sex as a desire, issue, was a taboo. Music and sex. Your thoughts?
Music and sex are often confused because both involve intimacy. But intimacy alone is not the point. Sex at its best is presence, attention without distraction. Music at its best is the same thing, only more honest. A body can pretend. A note cannot. Both require listening. Not waiting your turn, not performing, not rushing toward release, listening. When either becomes mechanical, it turns empty. When either is done without respect, it becomes exploitation. But here is the difference people avoid naming. Sex can be careless and still be pleasurable. Music cannot. Music demands discipline, control, restraint. You must know when not to touch a note. That is why great music lasts longer than great sex. It carries memory, consequence, history. When people say music is like sex, they usually mean pleasure. I mean commitment. A real performance is like real intimacy. You are exposed, you are accountable. And if you lie, everyone can hear it. That is why mediocre music is boring and dishonest sex is forgettable. The best of either leaves you changed.
How about yourself? Personally, Nina?
For me, music was more demanding than sex and more faithful. Sex came and went. It could comfort, disappoint, distract, even betray. Music never did that. Music asked everything of me every time, and it gave back unless I was fully present. That kind of relationship is rare. When I sat at the piano, there was no seduction, no performance for approval, only exposure. Music did not care whether I was desired, admired, or understood. It only responded to truth. If I was unfocused, it punished me. If I was honest, it carried me. Sex could make me feel less alone for a night. Music forced me to face myself for a lifetime. There is also this: sex can be shared without being understood. Music cannot. If someone truly understands your music, they have touched you more deeply than most lovers ever will. That kind of intimacy is frightening. That is why people avoid it. So personally, very personally, music was not like sex. It was closer to a vow, difficult, unforgiving, and impossible to abandon without losing part of myself. That is why I stayed.
Your life story was difficult, and I highly appreciate your openness. 2026. So many challenges. Any ideas?
Responsibility is a word people use when they want to soften the truth. If you are an artist and you are not reflecting the moral crisis of your time, then you are a decorator. That was true in 1963, and it is true in 2026. Oppression has simply learned better public relations. Identity without discipline is marketing. I was not black instead of being an artist. I was black while mastering Bach. The danger now is confusing visibility with substance. You don't liberate yourself by being seen. You liberate yourself by being undeniable. I would position myself where I always did, in opposition, not to institutions for the sake of rebellion, but to comfort. Comfort is the enemy of transformation. Whether you're singing in a basement or on a global platform makes no difference if you're telling the truth without apology. Precision, not volume, not outrage. Precision. Say exactly what hurts, exactly who benefits, and exactly why you refuse to be silent. The rest is entertainment. Hope is not my profession. Clarity is. But if people are still listening deeply, really listening, then yes, there is always a chance. Music doesn't save the world. It reminds the world what it has tried to forget.
Nina Simone, you are one of the GOATs. Who are yours?
Johann Sebastian Bach. He taught me structure. Freedom without structure is noise. Bach understood that rigor is not oppression, it is permission. Duke Ellington, elegance. He proved you could be sophisticated without being harmless. Billie Holiday. She sang truth without protection. Every note carried consequence. That kind of honesty shortens your life, but it deepens art. John Coltrane, a man in pursuit. He wasn't interested in being liked, only in being exact. That is spiritual discipline. Kendrick Lamar. He understands that language is a weapon and a responsibility. He uses complexity where others sell slogans. D'Angelo. He respects silence. That already puts him ahead of most. Groove, restraint, and vulnerability in equal measure. Björk. She refuses categories. That kind of refusal is political, whether she names it or not.
Nina Simone, thank you so much. It was a thrilling experiment and experience to have had you. Well, a generated version of you in 2026. Any last comments?
Time never frightened me. Cowardice did. What I see now is noise, endless noise, with very little courage behind it. People have more tools than ever to speak, but fewer things they are willing to stand for. Technology hasn't changed the human condition. It has only made avoidance more efficient.
The Voodoocast. Pneumono ultra microscopic silicovolcanoconiosis. The black lung. Art, radicalism, sex. Interviews that never happen, generated by AI.